So these are the topics I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to present some evidence on the growth of world trade and the growth of global value chains. And then I'm going to talk about some mechanisms through some research that I've done with Eun-hee Lee on how global value chains can mediate or propagate tariff liberalizations into changes in inequality, especially changes in the skill premium. So just by way of context, Gordon did this thorough, broad sweep of all of the research on trade and the distributional consequences. What I'm going to talk about is just a small sliver in the pantheon of the sweep that Gordon did. So let me start with a picture that we're all familiar with, the growth of world trade. This is a picture of the export share of GDP from 1970 to 2016. I've got four countries, Korea, Mexico, the United States, China, and the world. In the interest of time, I'll just focus on the world, which is the line in red. And you see this general upward trend. And in 2008, right before the great financial crisis, exports as a share of GDP exceeded 30% worldwide, and that was about 2.5 times larger than it was in 1970. So this is one of the most commonly cited statistics, as you know, of the globalization of the world's economies since World War II. Now, a key feature of this trade growth has been an increase in vertical specialization, global value chains. There's a lot of terminology out there, global supply chains, the fragmentation of production, et cetera. And each of these terms comes with it many definitions. So from the outset, I just want to be precise about what I mean by global value chains. And the basic idea is when a firm or an industry or a country uses imported inputs to make something, a product, and some of that product is subsequently exported, then you have a global value chain. And the key feature of that is that some portion of that product is crossing multiple national borders. So one way of thinking about it is it's not intermediate goods trade, it's a subset of intermediate goods trade. It's that subset that is effectively crossing multiple borders while the production is occurring. So that's what I mean by global value chains. And in the literature and in the media, we're all familiar with particular examples. In the 1990s, it was the Barbie doll. In the 2000s, it was the iPhone. And there are many other micro examples of this, but we don't have a lot of aggregate data on it, or we didn't have a lot until recently. So I just want to report a couple of measures of these global value chains that are consistent with this definition that I just gave. And one of them is value-added exports, and the other is this measure of upstreamness of production from final demand. So let me start with value-added exports. The idea of value-added exports is to measure the domestic value added embodied in exports. So one way of thinking about production is production occurs from the use of value-added, labor and capital in particular, and then also intermediate inputs. And some of those intermediate inputs are sourced domestically and some are sourced from abroad. Now, those that are sourced domestically are produced themselves from some domestic value added and from some other intermediate inputs, some of which might be sourced domestically and some of which might be sourced abroad. So you can kind of peel back that production process all the way, in some sense, to the end, where ultimately you can break it out into just domestic value added and foreign value added. And what value added exports does is all that peeling back into those two categories, and it measures, as I said, the domestic value added component of exports. Now, it's typically reported as a share, so the idea is of $1 worth of exports, how much represents domestic value added versus foreign value added. And obviously, 1 minus that share would be the contribution of foreign value added. And 1 minus that share, this contribution of foreign value added, to be clear, is the amount of foreign value added embodied in, say, in a domestic good that is then subsequently exported. So this measure directly captures this multiple border crossing idea that's central to the way I've defined global value chains. So it's typically calculated with data from input-output tables, and I'm going to show a couple of pictures in a second. But one thing I want to mention as a caveat is that to the extent that countries rely a lot on special economic zones, China has done that, for example, with the Shenzhen zone, and before that, Mexico had all these border plants, the maquiladoras. To the extent that countries rely a lot on those, these measures of domestic value added using input-output tables will tend to overestimate the domestic value added content and underestimate the foreign value added content. So with that caveat, let me show some pictures from data from the OECD, the same 4 countries I showed before: Korea, Mexico, the United States, China, and then also the European Union. And you see a general downward trend. So again, that means that this, by the way, goes from 1995 to 2014, so the last 2 decades. And so the general downward trend just means that the domestic value-added content has been decreasing over time of exports, or in other words, the foreign value-added content has been increasing. Now, one exception, if you look at the purple line, that's China. As of around 2003, China's domestic value-added content was pretty low, lower than Mexico's or Korea's, for example. But since then, it's been increasing. And I think that's consistent with some other facts that we know about China in the last 10 years. But overall, the trend has been downward. As most of you know, the vast majority of international trade is in manufactured goods. So let me show a calculation on the domestic value-added share of manufacturing exports. And this draws from work by Rob Johnson and Guillermo Noguera, who along with Koopman, Wang, and Wei, and a couple of others, have really been the leaders in pushing the construction and implementation of these measures. So this picture goes further back to 1970 up to 2009. And what this chart shows is that the domestic value-added content of exports globally has fallen from about 2/3 to 1/2. Again, the flip side is that the foreign content has increased from about 1/3 to slightly over 1/2. So that means in some average sense, the typical manufactured export good globally embodies more foreign value-added than domestic value-added. So this measure of value-added exports shows, I think, pretty clearly at an aggregate level that global value chains, the presence of them has been increasing over time. So let me turn briefly to this other measure, upstreamness of production. So the idea here is it measures the distance of production from final demand. So again, just thinking about a typical production process, a firm or an industry makes stuff, and then some of that stuff is sold to final consumers or to firms for capital investment, but some of that stuff is also sold to other firms to be used as an intermediate in their production process. And that stuff that's sold to other firms to be used as an intermediate in their production process, when they make their good, those goods are further sold either for final consumption or, again, as another intermediate. So what this upstreamness measure counts is how many steps, how many intermediate good steps do you go through before you reach the final consumption. So these are measures that Paul Antras and Devine Chor, as well as several other people, Thibault, Foley, and others have constructed. And again, you can use input-output tables to calculate them. And again, the idea of this measure is that to the extent there's greater upstreamness, that's consistent with having longer production chains and longer global value chains. And so Antras and Chor report that upstreamness in the world between 1995 and 2011 increased by 10%. So again, this is consistent with increased global value chains. So that was just a brief summary of aggregate global countrywide measures on global value chains, and I think they show pretty clearly that these have been increasing. So now I want to shift gears and talk about the role of global value chains in mediating and propagating trade liberalizations into changes in inequality and changes in the skill premium in particular. And so this these next few slides, draws from joint research with Eun-Hee Lee at the University of Maryland. So the motivation, we had two motivations. One is the facts that I just presented on the increasing prevalence of global value chains. And the second is some of the research that Gordon talked about in the past. There was a lot of empirical research that evaluated the effects of increased international trade on inequality, and a lot of this research was also summarized in this excellent survey paper by Nina Pavchnik and Penny Goldberg. And what they found in their survey is that when you had these bilateral liberalizations, that inequality or the skill premium tended to increase in both countries. And so that was an interesting finding because that was inconsistent with kind of the dominant theoretical paradigm which comes from the Heckscher-Lin model, this Stolper-Samuelson mechanism, in which one country's skill premium should increase, but the other country, the country that has a comparative advantage in less skilled intensive activities, to the extent that the less skilled workers benefit from the trade liberalization, their relative wages should rise, and hence in that country the skill premium should fall. So this fairly robust empirical finding across a number of studies was inconsistent with that paradigm. So basically the goal of our paper is to leverage this increase in GVCs, but also try to build a theoretical framework that allows for more transmission mechanisms so that an increase in the skill premium in both countries can be an outcome, and in particular build in global value chains as well as endogenous labor supply. And then use that framework, quantify that framework. Gordon talked in his talk about GE, general equilibrium. That's what this framework is, just a general equilibrium framework with some numbers attached to it, and use that to evaluate the quantitative effect of the China shock, just focusing on the bilateral reduction of barriers between the US and China, and then look at that effect on the skill premium. So I'm just going to try to summarize our framework in one slide. So the global value chain aspect comes from this first, the way we're characterizing production. It occurs in multiple sequential stages. Each stage uses some value added and a composite intermediate. But the key part is that the downstream stages use the upstream goods as an input into its production process. So that's the way that we're bringing in the global value chain part. And then we have a richer labor structure than is typical in these models, in that potential workers are heterogeneous, so they vary in their type. There are college and non-college educated workers. But even within the type, they vary in their skills and their ability to succeed in different sectors and occupations. And they're just going to pick the sector and occupation that maximizes their wage. So some of you may recognize this as the Roy model. So we just are mixing essentially a global value chain framework with a Roy model. In terms of international trade, we can have the stages separated and sourced in principle by different countries, but of course we're going to have trade barriers, both they could be political or technological barriers, and then at the end of the day, international trade is going to be motivated is going to occur through a comparative advantage that can occur across different dimensions, relative factor supplies or relative technology differences. And these can also vary across stages of production. Finally, so we've got the production side, the labor side, international trade. Then our framework is going to deliver implications for the skill premium in response to reductions in trade barriers. And as I said, it goes beyond this Heckscher-Lin paradigm in that we're going to have several other transmission mechanisms, hence giving the potential for an outcome where the skill premium can rise in both countries following a trade liberalization. So that's the framework. In terms of taking it to the data, we use a three-country setup with the US, China, and a composite rest of the world. In this paper, we just have two stages of production, an upstream and a downstream stage. We have three sectors, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and services. The value added on the labor front occurs through 5 occupational inputs that vary according to the tasks involved. So for example, managers is one, production workers is another. And then there are 2 worker types, college educated and non-college educated. There are a lot of parameters in our setting. This might seem like a fairly simple setting, but it's fairly rich. There are a lot of parameters, and we choose parameters, either some that are coming from other related studies, and other parameters are chosen so that the model has implications for shares of output, relative wages, et cetera, that are consistent with the data in the US, China, and the rest of the world. So that's our framework, and then this is how we put numbers to it, and then we're going to run our main simulation exercise, which is this reduction in US-China trade costs by 50%. So this is the main result. I'm just going to focus on this result that we get when we run that simulation. We find that the model implies an increase in the skill premium in China of about 2%, an increase in the skill premium of the US of about 1%, and basically no change in the rest of the world. So what's going on here? I mean, one advantage of using models, of course, have pros and cons, but one pro is that we can tease out kind of the intuition, the explanation, and some of the forces at work. And it is driven by comparative advantage, but in our framework, we have both comparative advantage at the sector level and at the stage level. And in our framework, China, in terms of understanding the result for China, their comparative advantage is in manufacturing. But it turns out that manufacturing draws in the less educated workers. So to the extent that this liberalization moves China more towards manufacturing, that's actually going to be a force to reduce the skill premium. But in addition, China specializes in downstream stages. And then it turns out in the parameterization of our model, the downstream stages are relatively more skill intensive than the upstream stages. So so to the extent that China moves more to the downstream stages, there's going to be greater demand for the higher skilled occupations, and it turns out the more highly educated workers move into those highly skilled occupations, so that's going to be a force for increasing the skill premium. And you can tell by the final number, the fact that it's positive for China, that this stage level comparative advantage effectively it dominates the sector level comparative advantage. So that's kind of the story for how our model can imply an increase in the skill premium in China. For the U.S., it's a little bit more of a standard result. Both the sector and stage level comparative advantage work to increasing the skill premium in the U.S. But kind of the summary of what we have is that owing to the presence of global value chains, this trade liberalization basically leads both countries to take advantage of stage specialization as well as the usual sector specialization, and that can deliver outcomes where the skill premium can rise in both countries. We have other tables in our paper that try to isolate the specific role of global value chains, and we find that it does play a key quantitative role in generating this outcome. So those numbers that we got, how do they compare to the actual changes in the skill premium? Basically, they can account for about 1/3 of the increase in China's skill premium between 2000 and 2007, and about 1/5 of the increase in the US skill premium in the 2000s. So just to wrap up, I showed some evidence on the increasing prevalence of global value chains, and then I showed how, then I talked about this research with Eun-Hee Lee on how global value chains can act as a propagation mechanism from trade liberalization to changes in the skill premium. And that's really the main conclusion. And then if I might want to take a step back, we can also talk about some of the recent policies pursued by the current administration. And owing to global value chains, and this is something I think all of you are familiar with, the policies, especially vis-a-vis Canada and Mexico, could backfire. And just as an example, this work by de Gortari, who combines input-output table data with firm-level data, has basically shown that the typical U.S. import from Mexico embodies about 50% U.S. value added. So putting a tariff on U.S. imports from Mexico is effectively putting a tax on U.S. firms. So I'll stop there. Thank you.